All right, so we are setting good example here of starting right on time. So I will wait 10 seconds until it becomes 4. Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome. So my name is Youngju Ryu, and I'm the director of the Nam Center for Korean Studies. And I have the most delightful job of, first of all, thanking everybody for coming to the talk this afternoon, and also of introducing our speaker for the day. And this is the first Korean Studies Colloquium of the year, and so the pleasure is doubled on that account. Sonja Kim is a historian of Korea and of gender and women's studies at Binghamton State University of New York, where she chairs the Department of Asian and Asian American Studies. She received her BA in history at Yale University, and then went on to do her MA and PhD at UCLA in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures, where I also got my MA and PhD. So our friendship and intellectual camaraderie go a long ways back. I'm so thrilled to have her here. In terms of her published work, she is the author of Imperatives of Care, Women and Medicine in Colonial Korea, published in 2019, and the co-editor of Future Yet to Come, Science, Medicine, and Technology in Modern Korea, published in 2021, and articles and book chapters in both Korean and English that query the fascinating topic that range from ethics of care, politics of birth control, and eugenics and hygienes in early modern and colonial Korea, and beyond. Professor Kim is also a tireless and committed field and program builder, in addition to serving as the chair of a department, which is a job and a half in and of itself. She heads the Northeast Asia Council as a board member of the Association for Asian Studies, and also serves as the interim director of the Institute of Asia and Asian Diaspora. So I feel very honored and happy to be able to invite Professor Kim to the stage now and ask her to enlighten us about her scholarship on the topic of reproductive desires in colonial Korea. So please come up on the stage and receive our welcome.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Evan and Seon for also helping me with my logistics in getting here. Obviously to Professor Liu for inviting me, as well as all of you, because I know it's Tuesday afternoons at our campus are very busy. And so the fact that you took your time out and elected to come listen to me is also especially meaningful. Looking back on my trajectory, it's also especially meaningful because the first time I ever spoke on this topic or gave a presentation on this topic was actually on this campus in 2007, I think. So that's many years ago. And it's been quite an exercise to think back about how my ideas may have changed or grown or discarded or remained the same. And so today's talk is actually more of a reflective piece. It's not necessarily representation of new or current research, but more about my attempt to synthesize various threads I have about thinking from my first book, later projects, conversations I had with my students, and also related to things that I've been seeing or noticing in the news and current events. So I welcome you to join me in conversations on Korea and what I call reproductive desires. I forgot about this. Hold on. Okay. So a 1950s draft of a South Korea's medical bill stated that its purpose was to improve the health of its citizens, as well as to support the eugenic development of the Korean people. Now, this bill was modeled on colonial period legislation, and in the end, the term eugenics was removed. But several years later, in an interview, Lee Gap-soo, who is a physician and a leading figure of the eugenics movements both in colonial and immediate post-colonial Korea, expressed his continued regret that eugenics legislation was not enacted. But the appeal of eugenics and its associations with the desire for a stronger nation would not die, however, and was legislated 2 decades later in the 1973 Mother-Child Act. Now, this act permitted the reproductive interventions such as abortion and sterilization for eugenic reasons as defined by the legislation, and at a time when abortion was criminalized and citizens were mobilized in aggressive family planning campaigns as part of the country's economic development plans. Now today, as many of you are probably well aware, South Korea has one of the lowest fertility rates in the world. And while family planning measures contributed in part to this, observers also attribute rapidly shifting political economies, including the housing market, values, lifestyles, and social formations in diminishing national fertility. And concerns over the economic impact in relation to labor productivity and age structure had prompted national and local governments, corporations, and organizations to fund programs and initiatives to curb and reverse the decline. And when I was doing a search in the newspaper, I found this. So apparently today in South Korea, this was just a month or two ago, different cities are sponsoring blind matchmaking events in the hopes of producing or creating different couples that come out of it. But these highlights really highlight these efforts really highlight the prominent role that reproductive interventions continue to play in organizing the social polity. Now, the fact that reproduction is inextricably linked to the political economy and the social fabric in South Korea is not really particular to Korea, right? We know that. However, what I'm thinking is that its former status in the Japanese Empire and its geopolitical place in the Cold War world order make South Korea an interesting case to study global health interventions and nation-building mobilizations. So demographers hold South Korea's family planning campaign as a successful model in efforts to stem what was perceived as a global health crisis produced by overpopulation. Gender and cultural studies scholars assess critically the impact South Korea's reproductive interventions have on health services, gendered citizenship, sexuality, and lived experiences. And more recently, the country's forays into biotechnologies such as stem cell banking, genetic screening, and fertility services draw attention to science, technology, and society studies scholars. So, drawing from these perspectives applied to an earlier time, I'd like us to examine interventions to shape human reproductive outcomes, as well as the desires that are embedded in those interventions in the colonial Korean context. So, historicizing strategies to achieve diverse visions for the body politic illuminates the centrality of individual bodies that are differentiated in gendered, racialized, classist, and ableist terms in Korean social imaginaries. Some of these imaginaries lingered, taking new shape in Cold War South Korea. So today the talk will be starting with articulations, or what I call the population problem, and its various forms in colonial Korea and the Japanese Empire at large, including knowledge production of bodies and medical sciences. These informed material practices such as childbearing, but it also shaped women's experiences as care providers and subjects of care, and as well as it opened spaces for the involvement of new actors, including female and foreign missionaries. And then I will close by considering how the case of colonial Korea provides a deeper contextualization of the politics of reproduction in Korea's long 20th century. Okay. So the colonization of Korea in 1910 was euphemistically couched as an act of Japanese imperial benevolence. It stemmed from their desire to promote the well-being of Korea and its people. And one consequence of such benevolence was the establishment of a new system of health and medical services throughout the peninsula. Do note that I'm using benevolence in euphemistic terms. So while colonial authorities tacitly allowed for limited continuation of older healing traditions, a network of public and private hospitals, including those operated by foreigners, emerged unevenly throughout the peninsula. And what emerged was the transformation of educational, medical, and public health infrastructure that authorized biomedicine and birthed an elite professional class of physicians who privileged a new knowledge system marked scientific. But also emerged on the peninsula were human and life science research institutions that networked across the Japanese empire. And so in Korea, these were centered at Keijo Imperial University, which is known as the predecessor of Seoul National University today. And while social scientists, physicians, and other intellectuals studied diverse topics, they also shared a faith in what they considered to be objectivity and science. And they believed that these would offer solutions to problems that plagued human society and governed bodies. And when I was looking at this research, what I noted was that the research was directly or indirectly related to what the Japanese empire called the population problem, or jinko mundai, or in Korean, ingu munje. So this was a problem that was globally at large, but also regionally in the empire, and more locally also in the colonies. And these discussions moved beyond the academy and circulated among settler populations and the general public as well. So many of you may be already familiar with global population debates. These are usually expressed as alarm of Malthusian-informed predictions of global poverty created by overpopulation. These debates also intersected with those about anxieties about race degeneration, birth control and feminist movements, socioeconomic disruptions brought by industrialization and empire consolidations, as well as the mass human migrations that it followed. So expansion of the Japanese empire in Korea, Manchuria, and later China, and also into the Southeast Asia and South Pacific, connected the fate of the empire to its ability to harness what it called or considered as national power. So national power was gauged across multiple measures that included food production arability, nutrition, industrial development, as well as population-related patterns of emigration and settlement, mortality rate, health outcomes, and other social markers. This produced a statistical or enumerative regime that reflected the transformation of Korea's household registration system, as well as the empire-wide implementation of the census that was first implemented in Korea in 1925. So it was believed that developments in the biological sciences could solve social problems, or at least that was the hope. So what are some examples of these solutions? It could include screenings at national borders and the deliberate movement of particular populations, both desirable as well as not. Women's bodies, including their sexuality and fertility, were of particular interest and produced attempts to curb or promote their reproduction by applying racial, national, or biological criteria. And interwar Japan, for example, desires to optimize the population's procreative qualities and quantity as a means to address socioeconomic problems, informed their birth control and motherhood protection debates. So human and medical research in the Japanese empire was part of a larger knowledge power nexus that made populations, both the Japanese as well as what they considered the other, or what we might consider as the other, legible. And it supported these interventions that became aligned with administrative interests. So examples in colonial Korea might include those studies, such as of those of what they called special populations. These tended to be impoverished populations, namely the slash and burn farmers, the urban homeless, as well as the rural poor. There were also studies of the nutritional status of school children, demographic trends, as well as populations in Manchuria and other parts of the empire. Researchers across Keijo Imperial University spearheaded many of these studies across multiple departments. And population studies were also conducted in imperial universities across the empire, including those in Taiwan and Manchuria. So while researchers would articulate the need for public health or social interventions as necessary to improve the living conditions of their subjects, they also explicated racial difference, and this helped facilitate imperialist expansion within the archipelago as well as abroad. So what do I mean by difference? So difference was identified physically via health conditions or bodily measurements, so for example, how high they were or the weight of their girth. But they could also be ascribed culturally through their behavior or what they perceived to be as their conduct. So examples in the colonial Korean context. In 1910s, we have the physical anthropological findings of the Korean people conducted by anatomy professor Kubo Takeshi, who concluded that Korean difference indicated inferior cultural and social development levels and immutable racial traits. A decade later, we have gynecologist Kudo Takeki, who pathologized the early marriage of women, racializing it as a disease of the Korean people, or minjuk. His 1926 to 32 study of Korean female inmates utilized theories in Western forensic medicine and criminology, and claimed that early marriage manifested physiologically on women's reproductive bodies, as well as criminally on their propensity to murder their husbands, mother-in-laws, or masters. Other research placed women's menstruation as fundamental to their health and, by extension, their families and polity. So these inquiries contributed to a larger production of knowledge of Koreans. But one thing I do want us to remember is that racial difference was not inherently a foregone conclusion in the racial sciences. And I'm borrowing the words from Choi Hwan-hyun, who defines racial sciences as the scientific speculations of biological characterizations of populations. So while earlier measurements of bodies may have been premised on predetermined racialized categories, they were also informed by Japanese origin studies that identified, one, the heterogeneity among the Korean minjuk, as well as two, the biological relations that supported theories of Japanese or Korean ancestry of the Japanese. So then, where then would difference lie? Or if research suggests that immutably distinct bodies among different populations, or that they do not exist, then to what extent would genetics or human reproduction play in passing on those traits? And so it's really in these fault lines that the racial sciences maneuvered, fusing statistics, medicine, and eugenics. So in the it's not moving? Okay. So in the 1930s, researchers understood culturally specific groups as sharing biological properties. And this allowed them to use the word minjuk as a research category or unit. At the same time, some researchers also began to acknowledge environmental impacts on the body, thereby opening the body to material interventions that could serve to include colonial subjects as recipients of communal privileges, such as welfare. At the same time, they could subject them to imperial mobilizations. So for example, population studies could be used to support public health campaigns to improve school lunches, but at the same time, it could also form the rationale to relocate or to physically move what they consider to be troubled populations to other parts of the peninsula, particularly to the north. So in the 1930s and early 40s, research teams at Keijo Imperial University's Medical Department of Hygiene and Preventive Medicine, I know it's a mouthful, analyzed population statistics against diet, occupation, infant mortality rates, disease occurrence, biometrics, and other data markers in order to calculate a population's, what they call the vitality, the growth, the potential growth, strength, and capacity to survive. One thing I do want to note that this actually started with looking at the vitality of the Japanese people, and then later on moved over to the Koreans. So it overlapped with eugenic interest in the metropole, both to increase population size and improve its health. But it also implicitly measured the population's physical capacity to labor or to serve. And researchers would predict demographic trends, patterns, and theorize the impact of socioeconomic class, nutrition, and climate on the constitution or health outcomes of specific groups. So some researchers would suggest that over time, some of these traits might become inheritable over several generations. And so this is where we begin to bring in the focus of human reproduction. So miscegenation debates, for example, battled over whether children of mixed heritage, particularly between Japanese and Koreans or Japanese and others, would have degraded, enhanced, or similar capacities as their parents. And then popular representations in mass media ads for patent medicines, advice columns, and informative articles contributed to the scientific knowledge production of female bodies that conceptualized them in a reproductive and non-reproductive binary. So the care of postmenopausal women's health was overall generally outside the practice of gynecology. Women's potential or existing productive and reproductive capacity were their main currency. And so diseases that were labeled as women's diseases or 부인병, and this could include things such as early or late menarche, menstrual irregularity, strange discharges, sterility, fistulas, or other indications of what might be perceived as a sick womb was pathologized. And this invited self-care practices, pharmaceutical and surgical interventions, and advocacy to improve labor and educational conditions to protect women's reproductive organs and their future fertility. Anxieties about queer practices, such as masturbation and the sexual desires deemed as misdirected, excessive, or lacking, informed the policing of sexual relations. So, like many parts of the world, colonial Korea was not immune to the globally powerful ideological frameworks of eugenics. Sorry, excuse me. While eugenics played out differently, pending their local context, at its core was its evaluative logic that valued certain bodies over others. Related to anxieties around race and gender and class, eugenics also intersected with population management strategies, including welfare programs of modern states. Literally translated in Korean as superior births, it also guided the application of scientific knowledge to reproduce what were perceived to be desirable populations. Now, proponents pursue diverse approaches to prevent life. So this could be preempting, obstructing, or ending conception. They could produce a fitter life. This could include health policies, education, training. Eugenics could also generate more life by improving fertility or being pronatalist. And at the same time, eugenics could also end life. So all of these different ways or attempts and approaches, as well as the desires embedded in them, emerged in birth control debates, maternal health and infant welfare programs, marriage counseling, or other material practices in colonial Korea. I won't go so far into the history of it, but the eugenic ideas emerged at the turn of the 20th century, initially associated with social Darwinist theories, also with discussions about early marriage. But they coalesced in the 1930s with the inauguration of the Korean Eugenics Association, and this is a photo of one of its opening journals. Its membership roster was quite illustrious. They had many illustrious figures such in medicine, education, religion, and social groups, including Kim Hwan-lan, Lee Kwang-soo, and Yeo Eun-young. The association founders has stated that the purpose was to increase the happiness of society by improving the physical bodies and minds of future generations with the science of eugenics. And so while members might accept a spectrum between superior and inferior bodies, they differed over to where do they need to go, and they did not have consensus on the best means to realize eugenics. So they were informed by both colonialist and nationalist practices of inclusion and exclusion, and members disagreed on whether to prioritize the positive or good traits or the suppression of the negative or non-good. They also differed on whether to use direct or indirect means. In general, the undesirable qualities they did share was infectious disease, mental illness, intellectual and physical disabilities, weakness and debility, whether hereditary or not. And these ideas played out in their main activities, which was to educate the Korean masses on global eugenics theories and movements. They organized public lectures, roundtables, and publications with titles such as Eugenics Seen Through Biology, Family and Eugenics, Spouse Selection, Taegyo, loosely translated as fetal education, as well as introduced Nazi sterilization laws and sex education. Korean discussions of birth control emerged in the global context of population debates. And it's really in where eugenics was especially prevalent or became prevalent in these discussions. Now, product advertisements could not explicitly promote their contraceptive use. For example, you will see in the newspapers lots of ads for condoms. However, they were presented as effective in preventing venereal disease and less so in terms of as a birth control method. But what was interesting is that contraceptive knowledge did circulate in the print media. So you could find out what are the different kinds of devices that were going around the world. Condoms, pessaries, suppositories. You could learn about different technologies such as spermicidal agents, x-rays, douching, or other kinds of means to either prevent or contribute to conception. And readers could, once they learn about this, the physiological process of conception, could apply these knowledge to their own practices. Whether was to, they could use breastfeeding or withdrawal, the rhythm method, or fertility enhancing or blocking pharmaceutics. Multiple kinds of ways to either facilitate or to avoid pregnancy. And moreover, what's interesting is that certain devices were available for mail order. And some of the surveys that were circulated indicated that there were some women who deliberately and consciously implemented what they called as birth control. But much of the opposition to birth control came from its conflation with abortion and anxiety surrounding women's moral and sexual transgressions. And so abortion was criminalized in colonial Korea differently than it had been treated in colonial or in Joseon dynasty, as well as even in the Japanese metropole. So Joseon codes might have made punishable acts that resulted in women's miscarriage, such as injuring a pregnant woman, but women themselves were not penalized until the colonial period. And so it was in colonial Korea that when women seeking, as well as the persons who was inducing miscarriage, they became punishable with incarceration. So incarceration remained the punishment, or on the books, at least in colonial Korea. Over time in Japan, that later was changed into fines. And so we see that there's also a colonial difference even in the way the abortion law was applied. Abortion was allowed in cases when the mother's life was at stake, and it required a physician's diagnosis, and many physicians writing on this kept explaining that. And that also, at the same time, we have the discussions about the new woman or the modern girl, and so the increasing visibility of women whose professional and personal lifestyle choices challenged existing gender norms also fomented critique of birth control. It was claimed that birth control would give them the license for sexual promiscuity. And so we would see in the news also sensational news stories about extramarital pregnancies, miscarriage, as well as folk customs that were, or folk birthing customs, which all suggest that women did actively seek to take or to produce the reproductive outcomes they desired. These discussions, reading them in another way, we could also suggest that they indicate an othering process of Korean customs, healing traditions, as well as other familial or social formations. They also reveal class-based predilections, and so, for example, the more highly literate groups would elect surgical or pharmaceutical interventions, which including contraceptive devices that were not generally accessible to the population at large, whereas other women would inflict self-harm, whether it's ingesting lye or jumping off a high point, or as well as practice other means or measures that were believed to prevent pregnancy. But nevertheless, many Korean physicians and reformers did champion birth control. Now, birth control today in our world is generally associated with a woman's right to choose and make their own decisions. But in colonial Korea, birth control as a tool to decide when and how many children to have, rather to have children or not, dominated the discussion and curbed this liberatory potential for women as individuals. It's translated, the translation 산하제한, or limiting birth, was preferred over 산하조절, or controlling birth. And reasons to limit the number of pregnancies or spacing of pregnancy can include mitigating poverty, the financial burden placed on families, as well as protecting maternal bodies. So birth control over time, when we read the discussions, was eventually about to increase the potential of raising healthy, i.e. eugenic children, as well as to promote their fertility and prevent the debility produced by too frequent pregnancies. Birth control was also to ensure the availability of resources, and this include both financial, physical, but also time for mothers to educate and care for their children properly. So in the end, 산하제한 was tied to idealized gender constructions of the wise mother, good wife, and the biopolitics of the modern family. Protestant Christian and 1930s sweet home domesticities envisioned heterosexual and monogamous marriages of educated women and men. Yet women's education was oriented around their future and present roles, caring for the well-being of themselves and families. Now, work for women may draw them outside the home and outside the cottage industries, but usually these were framed before marriage. after which, and again, these are idealized notions, that they would rely on their salaryman husbands in small nuclear families. What we do know about the post-colonial context is that not many Korean families fit this ideal notions. But in the end, birth control was to postpone pregnancy and limit the number of children was permissible when it was connected with mandates to decrease infant mortality and raise better babies and produce healthy families. Oh, sorry. So, missionary physician Rosetta Sherwood Hall once remarked that when Korean female patients complained of sterility, they were in fact concerned about bearing male children who survived infancy. And so we can get a sense that infant mortality was quite high in colonial Korea. And so in this way, I'd like us to think about that, expanding our notions of reproductive interventions to also include maternal health care and infant welfare work. It was to protect women's fertility. That could also include caring for the babies in utero as well as post-birth. And this also correlated with post-1930s pronatalist agendas that began to dominate birth control and infant welfare discussions. So foreign missionaries established milk stations, public health nursing for pregnant women, and infant health clinics. The colonial government and social organizations sponsored protecting the mother and loving the child events. So these are baby shows or free infant exams, and these naturalized measures that indicate what was perceived as normal, superior, or aberrant growth. In the 1940s, the new Bureau of Health and Welfare promoted pronatalist measures. This included food rations, or increasing the food rations for pregnant women, abolished contraceptives, lowered the minimum marriage age, and encouraged large families. So I'm going to start skipping. And in some, eugenic discussions reinforced perceptions of Korean childbearing and rearing practice as backward and unsanitary. It produced new conceptualizations of childhood, as well as opening spaces for women's participation as educators, health practitioners, producers, and consumers of knowledge in reproductive care. So modern midwifery, for example, was established in Japan and its colonies as attempts to curb infanticide and improve maternal and infant mortality. And in colonial Korea, we see a lot of women who take advantage of these new education and professional occupations that become open to them. And we have figures such as nurse midwife Han Shin-kwang and Lee Keum-jun or Frances Lee, who are both instrumental in either organizing nurses or involved in the infant welfare work. We also have female physician Ho Young-suk, who published many articles on women's health, as well as receiving postdoctoral midwifery training and established one of Korea's first maternal health centers. Ko Hwang-kyung, who I'll talk a little bit about later, also worked in a Christian center for women and children. And as the Japanese Empire intensified its wartime mobilization efforts, it became increasingly difficult to disentangle eugenics from other forms of knowledge, including the promotion of sports and leisure. And oftentimes we don't think about eugenics as about leisure or recreation. The contents of the Journal for Eugenics overlapped with another journal at that time, which was 보건운동, a general health journal. And we would see also in the newspapers at this time cheerful images of vitality, fun, and recreation, like people who are dancing, skiing, sports, hiking, wrestling. This seems to contrast to what we are familiar with as the sort of the dark times of the late colonial period. And on one hand, one scholar considers this to be sort of the cultural, the soft side of eugenics in its cheerful images of the healthy body. But nevertheless, there is a darker side of eugenics that we're all aware of. And this took shape as the main area the main arena of organizing around eugenics was in the realm of marriage. And this produced, in colonial Korea, a stratified reproduction. Okay. So I take this concept from Shelley Colon. In gynecology, women's bodies were already divided between pre- and postmenopausal bodies. But eugenics and the desire for fitter bodies or babies delineated women's male bodies as well as premenopausal female bodies between those that should reproduce from those that should not. Now, on a bigger picture, stratified reproduction is not necessarily gender specific, but it was experienced differently by men and women. And it became evident in marriage counseling, compulsory sterilization, as well as the Japanese military sex slavery system. So for example, advice circulated in print media to examine the health history of one's future spouses and their families before marriage. These produced the cultural text that Eun Kim calls hereditary dramas that disavow disability and naturalize the desire for non-disabled children as a moral imperative. Eugenic marriage was achievable with careful selection of spouses. These are important not only to individuals and their households, but it was also presented as important to the prosperity of future generations. And marriage counseling became formalized in the 1940s with establishment of centers by the Eugenics Association as well as local governments. So besides genetic history, attendants would also look into the age of their potential partners, criminal tendencies, body shape, and health constitution of their potential partners. In Japan, the national eugenics law to prevent the birth of the unfit and promote the fit resulted in the targeting of disabled and diseased bodies for sterilization in the metropole. But Korean society in general was opposed to forced sterilization, and this law ended up not materializing in Korea. But after the passing of the Leprosy Prevention Act, punishments at the colonial government's Hansen's disease asylum on Sorok Island included forced sterilization, and only male residents who underwent sterilization were allowed to marry. Pronatalist Japan may have abolished the use of contraceptives in the metropole in Korea, but condom manufacturing did continue, and they were supplied throughout the war front where the Japanese military was, as well as to the stations of the military's brutal system of sexual slavery. So while this was ostensibly presented as to thwart the contraction of venereal disease by soldiers, what we do know from testimonies of women from this period is that abortion on pregnant women at these stations also indicate that their bodies' designation by the military as non-reproductive bodies. So what I've attempted to delineate so far here are the various efforts to resolve population problems with medical science and technologies in colonial Korea. These extended beyond the colonial administrators and researchers, and they ended up including Korean educators, journalists, and writers, and different healthcare providers. So they pursued a multiple of methods to pursue desired outcomes, whether to populate the Japanese empire with more able-bodieds, to uplift Koreans' genetic fitness, to achieve modern domesticities, to continue the patriline, protect one's position in their household, or pursue a particular lifestyle one desired. And so diverse reproductive desires generated the discursive medical and policy interventions to shape the outcomes in human biological and social reproduction on individual and collective scales. And these transformations had transformed material practices and attitudes within which reproductive politics unfolded in Cold War South Korea. And so I'm going to start moving on to post-war resonance. So how does this history matter in the wake of radical transformations after 1945? The end of the Asia-Pacific War and power realignment brought new actors. It brought new products and techniques and resources and agendas into place. Yet I note different resonances that reverberated between reproductive desires and frameworks of before and after 1945. And most notable were the tying of reproductive outcomes to economies and sovereignty of national states, the persistence of eugenic ideas, and women's desires to practice birth control. So what are some of these resonances? Well, key figures. So for example, I mentioned Lee Kap-soo, but there are other important figures from the colonial period who continued their organizing work in the immediate post-colonial period. Lee Kap-soo, who was an active Korean Eugenics Association member, supported the sterilization of targeted populations, marriage counseling, and birth control for lower socioeconomic classes. Ko Hwang-kyung continued women's and children's social work as an educator, came to Michigan, I don't think here, but came to the state of Michigan to study social work, eventually returned to Korea, and was a founder of one of the founders of Daehan Omunihwe, or the Korean Mother Society, and was a member of the National Family Planning Task Force during Park Chung-hee's administration. Mothers' clubs of the 1960s and 70s were organized similarly to women's groups in colonial period infant welfare work. 1950s women's journals and other media indicate the reemergence of women-centered positions that advocated access to birth control in South Korea, despite the government's official pronatalist stance. Now, these voices might have been later subsumed by the encompassing mobilizations of the state's family planning campaigns in the late 60s and 70s that legitimized birth control to curb population growth as economic development with a targeted focus on quantifiable outcomes of fertility reduction. And so this is a shift that I would say from the Japanese imperial frameworks of the population problem. So we're moving from population problem to population control. What also continued was the logics of stratified reproduction that became codified in the 1973 Mother-Child Act that was mentioned in the opening, that effectively legalized abortion on eugenic grounds and sanctioned the disqualification of disabled women for reproduction. And one of the more egregious examples of this violence was the forced sterilization of women with intellectual disabilities until the 1990s. And in South Korea's social imaginary, reproductive female bodies, those who could be mothers, were thus limited to non-disabled women in monogamous, heterosexual, and legally recognized marriages, thereby excluding sex workers, single women, and women in unions with non-Korean men. Another thing I would like to point out is the framework of colonial entanglements can also expand our analysis of historical continuities. South Korean medical exchange and cooperation in anti-parasite and family planning campaigns of the 1965 ratification of normalization treaty between the two countries drew from each country's specific concerns, but also from their former colonized histories. And global-wide imperial networks and knowledge and experiences such as single disease elimination strategies informed post-1945 global health policies and dovetailed international developmentalist agendas that we see in South Korea. So one of the questions that plague me that I really don't have a complete answer to is on what basis then should we assess, evaluate, and judge reproductive technologies? On the qualitative improvements on the lives of individuals or families, on meeting program or development goals, relying on archives from development aid sources, or maybe the International Federation Planned Parenthood, or other South Korean family planning campaigns. If we just rely on those archives, it could suggest success. But one thing I would like us to think about is that these kinds of views of looking at reproduction places too much emphasis on states who have the resources and capacities to organize on large scales. And too often we speak of reproductive politics in the language of women's choice, rights, and justice. And while these are important today and relevant today, they may not be, and I'm afraid of I'm open to contesting here, but it may not best describe the reproductive interventions in colonial Korea. For one thing, it narrows our focus only onto women's agency, but we forget that the frame of choice in which one is expected to exercise their agency, that it in and of itself has a history. The right to choose requires recognition of women as a legal subject when they were not. It also assumes that feminist desires to control or restrict reproduction when there might be multiple kind of reproductive desires that were sought, or different outcomes. I also think it might be modernist to presuppose that reproductive interventions only begin with modern contraceptives or medicalized abortion or other biomedical technologies. Koreans have produced and consumed local knowledge and practiced techniques to achieve desired reproductive outcomes long before the 20th century. And it is in this longer history that I think informs the context within which the 20th century reproductive politics operated. In addition, it's also less about the technology that drives reproductive practices that I'd like us to think about, and more about the desires that mobilize the institutions, policies, resources to innovate, to produce, or make available the material products and technologies to produce the desired reproductive outcomes. Women's participation, or what some might consider to be an embrace of family planning and population control measures, are shaped by powerful vested interests. And as Eun-jung Kim reminds us, decisions such as sex-selective or race-based and disability-based abortion and other reproductive strategies should consider historical contexts in which sexism, racism, and ableism exist. In other words, a woman's right to choose does not exist in a vacuum. So the relative absence of the language of reproductive rights and justice in the dominant discourse in colonial Korea, in contrast to its visibility today in South Korea, illuminates shifts in Korean social imaginaries, as well as the impacts of women's in disability activism and political organizing. These suggest new directions in research on Korea's reproductive politics. If South Korean state actors implemented family planning measures with little reference to gender, scholars today are now take gender politics right at the center in order to better understand lived experiences. So Bae Young-gung highlights 1950s male participation in family planning. So for example, some of the publications of the Korean Mother Society suggested ways that their members can secure their husband's cooperation without threatening male authority. John DeMoa notes that the idea that Korean men should voluntarily limit their desire to father children was quite radical and needed careful presentation to gain acceptance. Male celebrities were used in family planning publications to reverse associations of vasectomies with disability and criminality. Mandatory male conscription and military reserves training also combined the pragmatism, patriotism, and masculinity in their messaging. Eun-ju Cho describes the celebration of sexual pleasure in official publications of the Planned Parenthood Federation of Korea by acknowledging desires for sexual harmony with spouses and sexuality as intrinsic property of human beings. And this places sex right as central and not peripheral to reproductive politics. This opens a discussion of sexuality and masculinity that may be further explored in colonial Korean scholarship. Other directions to explore further include reproductive desires, politics, and practices related to mixed race discourses, North Korea, and oral history. So scholars note shifts in Japanese racial discourses from a stress on heterogeneity and Pan-Asianism during the empire to one that's focused on ethnic homogeneity that informed as well the exclusionary practices of Koreans and other groups in post-war Japan. Likewise, both Korean states in the North and South in the post-45 era acknowledge a Korean ethnic homogeneity. So in the South, this was legislated in the family law that initially incorporated as citizens only those fathered by South Korean male citizens, thereby removing access to privileges such as education to, and stigmatizing those of non-Korean paternity. The resulting renunciation of mixed-race children is part of Korea's reproductive desires, and is also related to the mass transnational adoption practices that we see. Moreover, this relates to discourses of racial purity in the medical sciences and eugenics. And if mixed race is categorized as a social handicap, i.e. disabled, and disability is targeted for welfare interventions, including adoption overseas, and then can we think of adoption as a form of eugenics, a reproductive tool for producing a desired population? To what extent do colonial frames intersect with these practices in South Korean state building? What and how did marriage counseling post-45 reflect principles used before? What about adoption in a period of transitioning definitions of family and kinship? Formally, the North Korean state adopts a pronatalist stance. It has no official birth control policy. Yet the state also provides access to reproductive care, including birth control in its public health system. It provides nurseries for the care of the young and acknowledges women's right to inherit, work, and divorce. It's true that scholars underscore a gendered politics that posits equal rights as an institutionalized gender division of labor in the household. But what were the reproductive, or what are the current reproductive desires in the North? And do we see similar links to the colonial past? And as more archival sources become uncovered and oral histories collected, we may pay more attention to women's voices. Not so much in identifying agency or resistance, but in terms of hearing their lived experiences and how they view themselves and their actions. Furthermore, what other kinds of reproductive desires may we find? So for example, Ko Hwang-young, during the early years of the family planning campaigns, stressed the sacred rights of mothers to be able to provide the spiritual nutrition and moral education for their children, which hark back to Christian discourses in colonial Korea. So then and now, reproductive desires in Korea are intimately tied to gender norms, expectations, and by extension, citizenship. We see this today in immigration laws that frame migrant bride citizenship as mothers and revoke residency of motherless divorced foreign women. State-led interventions to achieve particular reproductive outcomes produce new levels of governmentality that invite state inspection of intimate lives of women and their families. Along with providing means for women to control their reproduction came, in the words of Eun Cho, a code of conduct. Officially articulated was the urgency poverty posed for economic development and rehabilitation. But it also encoded a heteronormative family as the basic social unit, with women's reproductive activities at its core. So if reproductive interventions involve tangible techniques and technologies of sexual and reproductive health in which politics were inscribed, then the politics that the colonial period left behind were imbricated in and essential to gendered, racialized, nationalist, and imperialist orders. It is in these spaces that Korean reproductive desires continue to play out at the global, national, local, and individual levels. Thank you.
So we have a couple of mics up here for people who want to ask.
I made it close to 45.
I can start with one. Turn it on? Okay. So thank you for the talk, Sonja. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on the value and emphasis placed in Korean society on this idea of compatibility and suitability in marriage, which manifests itself in many ways. From 궁합, even 속궁합, referring to sexual compatibility, all the way up to what in today's parlance is spec 맞추기, right? You have to have the right spec for the bride and the groom. Otherwise, this is a marriage that's bound to be in trouble. So this notion, I think, which has, has much longer history than the colonial era, and it's had continuity into the present, as we can see. Mm-hmm. How do you think this reproductive desire, especially in the context of eugenics, which is the most aggressive form, I think, manifestation, articulation, and most optimistic view of the human capacity to create the perfect match that then would result, presumably, in the most desirable outcome or offspring. How does that episode either interrupt, reinforce, complicate, I think, the longer timeline of the value that is placed in something like, I don't know, 궁합.
Leave it to you to give you a very hard question that I can't answer, which you probably can answer better than I can. Compatibility in marriage. Actually, that's a very good question because we see this emerge in multiple ways. A lot in literature. Scholars talk about the emergence of romance in the early 20th century. New works in pre-modern Korea also talk about how romance existed in Joseon, that we forget and that we've sort of left to the sideline. And sometimes, even in today's popular media, right? So TV shows or even songs. So I guess the question, so reproduction. So if, in terms of the dominant discourse, reproduction should happen, right? It's supposed to happen in what is perceived as legitimate families, so familial structures. And then if we think of compatibility only as sanctioned only in those marriages, then they would overlap. But if we're thinking about today's context, and I don't know, I don't live in Korea today, but based on just passing observations, I think the concept of compatibility has shifted and changed a lot. Or maybe what I should say is that notions of compatibility that might not have been recognized before now has become visible and even celebrated, right? So when does, but that's a very good question. So if we look at, and again, you're probably the better scholar at this than I am, but in my very limited knowledge or reading of some of the just literary works that have come out, compatibility or marriage, I mean, so when economic developmentalist agendas were a lot stronger, you might sort of see this discussion. In the neoliberal context of today, you might see the term spec coming up a lot more in today's world. When we're looking at couples who have no desire for children, and that's part of the larger picture here, then compatibility is really more about individual happiness, and what they perceive to be as happiness or companionship. So this is just one of many desires, reproductive desires. I don't think that everyone shared these desires. I don't think, I'm pretty sure everyone did not share those desires. So I guess that's my very yes and no kind of answer to that question. Anyone could also address that question. They know more than I do. Yes? Oh, I don't know.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. It was really interesting. And regarding your question about how to evaluate reproductive techniques, technology, I think I have two questions, especially in the colonial era. So I'm wondering what the reproductive techniques afforded for Japanese women, whether the eugenic approaches were different. So, because when you talked about stratified reproduction, I thought about that maybe the Japanese empire encouraged Japanese women to give birth, but not for colonial Korean women. But then you mentioned that actually they allowed Korean women to get sterilized, and then my mind started thinking to the direction like maybe the Japanese empire needed like men forced to be mobilized for the war, or so in terms of the relating the reproductive politics with the historical context. I also had a question about when you mentioned that there was a new model for motherhood or child well-being, and for whom it would be understood as better, good model. And then my second question was also, it's about whether there was a reproductive techniques for men, like for Korean men or Japanese men. So different for different gender. What did it look like?
Okay.
Thank you.
Good questions. Okay, so let me first talk about eugenics. So Laura Briggs, in her book on Reproducing Empire, looking at, in Puerto Rico's case, the politics of birth control and eugenics played out very much differently than it did in the United States context. I mean, the United States, sorry, in the colonial Korean context. And part of the reason why I started with a discussion about medical research was it does dovetail, I think, Japanese racial politics, right? And how they perceive race and or ethnos, like what is there was a fine line, how do they differentiate that, what do they mean? And it's different kinds of inclusion and exclusion type of practices. So this also points to Japan and not everyone, and I shouldn't say Japan in terms of as though they're one entity. There were very diverse discussions about this. But when it comes to, in terms of official policy, what gets played out, for example, there were attempts to intermarry Japanese settlers in Taiwan with the indigenous populations, for example. And we know of the marriage between the prince in Korea with a princess in Japan. And then towards the late colonial period, we have more overt campaigns to promote intermarriage, particularly between Japanese women and Korean men. And there's some literature, if you're interested on this, about intermarriage in the empire. So in that sense, the discourse or discussion about not wanting Korean babies was not as overt or as visible in the colonial Korean context. We don't see that. We might see in different contexts. But what did it mean to be a better baby? That's a very good question. So depends on which literature you read, but overall, it was euphemistically labeled in terms of what they consider to be health. Right? Are the babies a certain size? And the number one concern, at least for Koreans in general, was the survival of infants, because the reality was many babies died. I mean, Korea did have, and around this also coincided with infant mortality discussions globally. I mean, and so we see even in the United States and other areas, infant welfare programs. Missionaries also bring some of these practices to Korea. Some of the practice also in Japan, which also might also be informed about what's going on in the United States and other parts of the world, also are brought to Korea. So it's hard to distinguish what's Japanese and what's Korean. Elite women who are schooled, have formal schooling, can read Japanese. And so they would read a lot of Japanese women's journals. And so they are familiar with what's also going on in Japan. So in terms of who should or should not have children, I think at least on the surface, it was, as I mentioned before, it was about non-disabled bodies, but for both Japanese and for Koreans. And then as you get into the war front, one of the things I'm also saying is women in the military sexual slavery system should not, sex workers should not, or I shouldn't say they should not, but it wasn't what was promoted. Officially, towards if we only go by slogans, what's popular notion, women on the war front, home front, men on the war front, those kind of constructs we see in the late colonial period would indicate that it was in the imperial interest to have more and more babies. Okay. I hope that answers your motherhood in when is it better? Okay. And you can also ask me if I'm not addressing some points. Techniques for men. Withdrawal. X-rays. In the classical medical text, there are more than others. There's a longer history of Yangzheng practices. Professor Ahn here might be familiar with them. You can ask him, perhaps. There are a lot of different, so even Taoist practice of longevity would be also related to this. When we talk about techniques for men, it depends on whether the goal is to promote fertility or to restrict fertility. And also, the question is sexual practices if it's related to notions of longevity or vitality. So yes, we don't, so they do come up. And condoms also were also talked about in that time period. So the reading is a bit dry because they're just basically, they kind of circuit or they find a loophole in sort of censorship by just saying, this is what we know about these technology or techniques in other parts of the world, right? These are things that people are using. This is Margaret Sanger. This is what she does. You know, so it's their method of informing the people. But I think that if you're a reader, I mean, me even reading it, I'm learning, oh, so they know about this, they learned about this. And they could technically use these methods, and I'm pretty sure people did. So, does that help answer your question?
What is X-ray supposed to
You know, I've been trying to figure that out. I've been asking like other medical historians, I'm like, what is the X-ray? So I'm thinking, are they severing the nerve? I don't know. And then that's another, I mean, that raises a good question, because what is the medical knowledge in the 1920s and 30s? It's not the same that we know in the 40s or 50s or 60s or 70s, right? So, yeah.
I do have a question
Mhm.
about this kind of minor thing, but in North Korea.
Oh,
So I know after the the arduous march, I believe that's the English term. I know they do have a serious population privacy, I believe. And I just want you, like, I know you kind of talked about North Korea, but can you expand on that?
that's why I put it in the last slide, for future research. That's something I do not know information about, and I welcome anyone to look into this. I did talk to my colleague, Susie Kim. I asked her, and we know what this is, and this is some of what she was saying, is that, like I said, officially public health, everyone gets it, it has access to it, but we also know that accessibility has been curtailed a lot, especially recent times. So I don't know the answer to that. But other scholars who look at gendered formations and domesticity in North Korea, at least what's official is as you say, they also promote notions of happy and healthy families, right? Ideal families, revolutionary families, right? So, but I don't know the answer to that question. Maybe you can let me know. That'd be great.
Go on, Ewan.
Any other questions?
I'll ask a question.
Okay.
I don't know if this question has an answer, but I couldn't help but think that the question of choice was really an important one for understanding the trajectory of eugenics in Korea. Mm-hmm. And in my shallow understanding of the subject, the sense that I got was that, in a way, the question of choice during the colonial period was framed by the instrumental logic of, modernization thought, right? Maybe I'm wrong. And in a way, you could almost read the story Heartless, I guess, as a euphemistic sort of narrative about eugenics, although it's not about reproduction per se. But if we frame it in terms of the importance of choice, right, and the health of the population, I think it could possibly have implications for that. But the question that I have is, the instrumental logic of modernization thought is no longer really operative in today's society, right, in Korea, or maybe I'm just wrong, but choice is still considered to be very important. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on what is framing the question or the discourse
Today?
of choice today, and how that's informing.
That's why I call mine in Colonial Korea.
But that's what.
Okay, thank you for that. So, yes, question of choice is an important one, and it's my approach when I look at the past or any society is really my questions. Why do people make the decisions that they do? Why do people act in a certain way? And then for me, it's to look at the material conditions around them to help me see, well, what was available to them. I'm not sure if people living in colonial Korea were necessarily constrained by the instrumentalist logic of modernity. I think that was only a limited part of the population. The reading literate public, right? I think that's, and it's kind of like reading against the grain, but if we read all these sensationalized news stories, I think it's showing us that people are making choices, and they are attempting to create certain reproductive outcomes. So I don't think that they were constrained by instrumentalist logic. However, if we're thinking about larger institutions that have the resources that can create sort of material conditions or can conscribe accessibility such as the state, then yes, the choices then becomes conscribed because the state operates on those instrumentalist logic, which becomes much more stronger and visible in the post-45 context. Writers might be writing about this and they talk about this and they think about this, but they actually can't really implement it on a large scale. And although maybe in Japan there was a lot more concerted efforts, it wasn't as, we only see it a little bit spurts here and there in very limited cases in colonial Korea. So today's context, I think choice is still important, and I think people are making choices, but the conditions now have shifted. What becomes permissible? So what's interesting in South Korea, and again, I'm not, maybe some of you who followed South Korea more closely might know more than I do, but while the technologies are there available, while the methods and the techniques and the goods are now available. So in that sense, those constraints are no longer there. Yes, there's no, but there are other things that can impinge on choice. So I mentioned beginning the low fertility rate, and now local governments are worried about this and creating different measures to try. Actually, you're the one who told me, right? A few days ago, there was a new something from way up above the presidential level, right? Attempts to increase the fertility rate. Actually, a personal story is how I came across my first book project was I was on a subway with my daughter trying to do field work in Korea way back when. And there were two grandmothers near me, and they saw me with her. She was a baby at that time. And then they looked at her, and they looked at me, and they asked me straight out, like, what are you feeding her? And I was like, that was really bizarre. I'm like, what do you mean by what am I feeding her? She was a round, chubby baby. Let's just say that. I said, breast milk? And they're like, okay, that was good, that was fine. And then she asked me, is this your only child? And I said, yes. And then they went all off on women these days are not having children, blah, 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 blah. And then it occurred to me at that moment, what if this was my miracle baby? Maybe I tried for years and years to conceive. And also, why can't I just have? I don't know. Anyway, so that was sort of the beginning thinking of my first choice. So going back to the question about choice today. So even though the technologies, the techniques, and the things are there, even though maybe the instrumentalist logic isn't there, I think there are other things that may impinge on choice. One is individuals today, maybe they feel like, I can't afford a house. I can't afford, to live right now. My workplace, is making me work all the time. Or maybe I actually don't want to raise a child, particularly today's South Korean context. So I think choice is now constrained by other considerations or different conditions. So that would be my answer, my response, I should say.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have two questions, but I have to write them down because I keep forgetting.
I do too. See, I wrote down.
So first, I'm curious about the role of religious belief. I mean, you talked a little bit about religious infrastructure. The role of religious belief, I guess, beyond the obvious context of fetal personhood or abortion.
Mm-hmm.
And then my other curiosity is how, I guess in contemporary Korea, the consumer service industry surrounding matchmaking or taegyo or fetal education and 산후조리, things like that, like postpartum care, how those things fit into your formulation of reproductive desires, if at all. Yeah.
Okay. Role of religious belief. Beyond abortion. Okay, so I'm not so sure. Well, I'm more familiar with Protestant missionary writings of colonial period and their notion of what a proper Christian family is. in some ways, and a lot of it is stressed around health and practices we can do to ensure that healthy family, right? Even today, we hear the term healthy family, right? And the family law like translates into, later on, post 2005, into the Healthy Family Act, for example. There's a very interesting relationship between, I mean, we probably are familiar with medical missions, Protestant medical missions in East Asia or other parts of the world. But beyond just giving services is, I think, also associated with notions of what a proper and healthy Christian family is going to look like. And so in that context, if we think about reproductive desires, it's about producing these kinds of family or reproducing these families. And this is why I brought in the other reproductive desire that Ko Hwang-young notes about in terms of spiritual development of moral children, which you could maybe say that this is very similar to Ko Dong's 1895 educational edict, which you could also say relates to maybe Confucian edifying tenets of the Joseon period, or it probably relates to other kinds of practices of what it means to be a moral person, human being. So in that sense, if we think of reproduction not necessarily only in terms of the physical act of bearing children, but in terms of producing the kinds of populations we want, then I think all religious beliefs and all religious institutions or practices may play a part in that. Today's consumerist services, matchmaking, taegyo, postpartum care, that I think is part of, well, one, in today's sort of more capitalist-oriented society, I think they're capitalizing on people's reproductive desires. If you're going to have one child, then you want to ensure that that child can get into Seoul National. I have no idea. I'm not sure. But, right? And so maybe they do cater towards the individual desires that parents or grandparents may have for helping produce or raise the child to succeed, whatever shape, way, or form that is. Postpartum care is interesting. That's something I actually I am interested in, but I haven't done much look into, partly because I was informed I had very bad 산후조리. And that was why I was sick all the time and couldn't do my research properly or whatnot, right? So, and LA, I went to grad school in LA. There's one hospital actually that gives myeokguk and does offer certain kinds of care for women if they're born in that hospital, and it's close to Koreatown, not exactly in Koreatown. Because that was my first foray into 산후조리. And after I had my child in UCLA, the nurse came in and said, "Oh, would you like to get in the shower?" And my friend who was with me, I said, no, she cannot take a shower now, right? And so, but what was interesting was I remember that my body, and this is why I'm kind of interested in health and medicine, is my physical body craved kimchi and rice after I gave birth. I couldn't stand the smell of it beforehand. And for one whole month, without fail, I actually had myeokguk because my body craved it. And so I was like, oh, maybe there is something to this. And then I experienced, now I can't remember what the word is. Flu-like symptoms. Oh, help me out. What is that? When you get sick all of a sudden. In Korean, they always say it all the time. 뭐?
입덧?
아니, 그게 아니고 열 갑자기 나오고 몸살 같은데 몸살. I guess 몸살. That's it. 몸살. 몸살 같은. And I didn't understand what that was. What is 몸살? I mean, because to me that means flu caused by a virus. Literally for every 3 weeks, during my first year, I had 몸살. And I thought, what is happening to me? And again, I was in Korea at that time. They told me, 산후조리 제대로 안 했으니까. Which means you just did not do proper postpartum care. So, and I guess what I'm trying to say is, I don't want us to discount some of the traditions and practices of the past. I think we should be free to explore them all. choose what works for us. I think we live in a time when we have multiple options. And who's to say how you're supposed to raise your child? Maybe that's just me. But so yes.
Is there one online question from a webinar participant?
Oh yes.
So we have one question from a webinar participant who's not disclosing his or her name. So how have anxieties about reproduction and birth rates factor into perspectives and practices like transnational adoption?
About birth rate and fertility? Transnational adoption? So I think there are other scholars who can probably speak to this better than I can. My understanding is that the height of transnational adoption, if we think about this, if we place it as starting around the Korean War and really accelerating in the 80s and 90s, this is a time when family planning campaigns was still going on strong. So the anxieties about birth rate was the anxiety there were still too many babies were being born or too many wrong babies. It sounds horrible to say. What I mean by that is that, and many of you may be familiar with the stigmatization of single mothers, or maybe of mixed race children, or and then the reality of sexual violence in South Korea. So I don't know whether the anxieties about these babies are necessarily, we can say that's equal or equated to transnational adoption, but I do think that they were facilitated by the social anxieties that may have not allowed different kinds of familial formations in South Korea, or made it very difficult for alternate familial formations. And so that would be, I guess, my way of responding to that question.
Would you take one more? Do you have a question?
Hi. So firstly, I did my undergrad at Bing. So
Oh, you did! Yay!
I actually
Go Bearcats.
I'm not in Korean studies, but I am doing a master's in international and regional studies here.
Mm-hmm.
And as part of our colloquium, we have to attend events from various centers that are not our own.
Well, I'm honored you're here to attend mine.
So like one of the reasons that I kind of was drawn towards the idea of reproductive rights, and one of the things that interested me a lot as a disabled person was the concept of disability rights and ableism here. So what I want to know is is there has there been kind of a disability rights pushback to the eugenics laws in Korea?
Oh yes. I recommend you read Eun-jung Kim's book, Curative Violence. And I think that's part of the things that I want to highlight here. So I can't claim credit for this, but really disability activism and political activism, both in Japan and in Korea, South Korea, really highlight the inequities in the structures of care in South Korea. I mean, some people might talk about, everyone has universal health insurance, but then we often don't talk about other forms of accessibility. And so, yes, there's a very, very active movement. On a personal front, my own personal family, part of the factors for wanting to immigrate here was for better access for members of the family, right? I also did grow up in a time period where, the legislation, even in the United States, is very recent, right? So if we think about it, even in college, right after I came out of college, some of my peers were working on legislation to pass disability rights in the United States. We didn't see handrails, or we didn't have access to these even while I was growing up. So it's a long road ahead. It's not over, but there are very, very many active groups in South Korea, and I encourage you to look into them. Yeah.
Can Can I, because I have a burning question.
Oh no, her question
Even though
scared
I
me.
think everybody's just waiting to be done. So I have a burning question that goes back to Yeonju's question about stratification in terms of reproductive technologies and the level of intervention that the state had during the colonial era. And it's probably too much information, but if I could share my own personal family history, my grandfather was a bigamist. So he married my grandmother who was Korean, and then went to Japan and married a Japanese woman who was totally out of his league. And he was allowed to marry her because there were apparently not that many men around, many Japanese men around at the time. So that the whole history made me wonder, and it goes back also to research that's been done on leprosy and leprosy control and the way the leper colonies as formalized spaces were more out in the colonies. As you moved further and further away from the metropole, you had the physical separation of the lepers in the way that you didn't have in the metropole. So you had it in an extreme way in a Sorok Island in Korea, maybe less in Okinawa, maybe less in Kyushu, and totally it's sort of integrated into the cityscape in Tokyo, for example. Right? So I'm thinking about the stratification. And wondering, was there, I guess it's ultimately a kind of a fact question. Was it a matter of law and policy that was explicit across the metropole and the colony and across the many different regions of the colony? Or was it a matter of implementation that, something like my grandfather's case seems to suggest? The laws were maybe uniform, but then there were lots of contingencies, and they were differently implemented in different loci in the empire. Yeah.
So eugenics legislation, when we think about it, and I often tell my students is, the main ones of this time period were the U.S. laws. Some people don't really realize that U.S. states passed, and in fact, I think the New York Times Magazine recently, in the past few months, featured this, that we are, and actually the other day I actually just read in Denmark talking about a lawsuit brought by indigenous women in Greenland against the state of Denmark about forced insertions of intrauterine devices without their consent. And so we see that eugenic practices or attempts to prevent certain populations from reproducing is, I think, more practiced from the state level in maybe US and European contexts than it would be in Asia. Susan Burns, and in terms of Hansen's disease or leprosy, has written about this around the Meiji period. And actually, someone here, Jennifer Robertson, has also written about eugenics in Japan's context. In terms of legislation, so again, both Japan and maybe colonial Korean, because colonial Koreans are reading and participating in discourses that we see in Japan, are reluctant to go so far as doing legislation. They might talk about it, they might promote it. Ikatsu is one figure who really, really want to push it. And then there are others say, no, let's just promote the positive. And that is what we're going to push for. So the legislation was in the Leprosy Prevention Act. And in Japan, I think Robertson has counted, only a few hundred were actually sterilized. And as I mentioned, in Korean context, it was more as punishment or as incentive, as opposed to compulsory. Although, some scholars might disagree. But what we do know is post-45, and a lot of scholars have written about this, that even though we knew or know biologically that it's not inherited, right? We know that it's actually not very contagious. Still, it was practiced for decades after. So in terms of legislation, I think that there was very few actually legislation. Now, one caveat, one difference, I should say. What's interesting is Tiana Norgren talks about this in terms of birth control in post-war Japan, and she has a book called, I think it's called Abortion Before Birth Control. And what's different in the legislation in Japan, in post-war Japan and post-war Korea, is that so the Mother-Child Act that I mentioned here talks about eugenic reasons, and they tended to be based on infectious disease or inherited disease or other forms of debility. In Japan's law, when it came to abortion, it was in terms, they also included a category that economic reasons was also included as a measure of eugenics. And the way I think reproductive politics play out in Japan, post-war Japan, is different from post-war South Korea. The birth control pill, for example, was not approved or legalized until the 90s, much later than it was in South Korea. Again, it's much longer history. But so even in the Asian context, we think of Asia as one monolith, but we can see that even Japan and Korea had different understandings that reflect their own conditions. So I can't say for sure about your grandparents, but yes, so I think it's more in what Eun Jung Kim calls heredity dramas that plays out culturally and socially, and we see this come out in literature a lot as well, as you're well aware.
So thank you. I think we're right on time.
Oh, okay.
Look at that. So thank you. Professor Kim taped a podcast earlier today about how she came to be the Koreanist that she is. And that's going to be available in a few months after we're done with editing. And a podcast program called Korea in Maize and Blue. So yeah, keep an eye out for it. Thank you very much.